I think you all know Anthony Romero, or know who he is, the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He's only the 6th executive director in the history of the ACLU, a history that is coming up to almost a century. And an organization that describes itself as the foremost defender of the rights enshrined in the United States Constitution. During his tenure, its membership has expanded substantially, as has the breadth and depth of its litigation, its advocacy, its lobbying, and its very important public education aspects as well, of which this is actually representative. He's the first Latino to head the ACLU, the first openly gay person to head the ACLU. He's also the first person in his family. We've been talking a lot about immigration issues over the last few days. The first person in his family even to graduate from high school. He graduated from Stanford Law School. He also has a degree from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And before his tenure at the ACLU, he was a leader in the civil rights and human rights activities of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Our topic today, in keeping with the theme of the overall Ideas Festival, is to look at 2024, imagining 2024. So while we'll talk a little bit about the situation involving civil liberties today, we're primarily going to try to forecast what things may look like over the next decade and a decade from now. Of course, it's impossible to some degree, as we've seen just this week, for example, and maybe I'll violate my principle and ask you a question about the Hobby Lobby case. But I mean, one of the things that makes it very challenging to predict is the fact that so many of these critical issues are decided by a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court. So even one change there could make a difference. But before we start looking in the crystal ball, you've been here in Aspen a few days. You may not have even had a chance to read the whole opinion and the concurring opinions, but what's your initial reaction to Hobby Lobby?
Well, that's an awful decision. And it will be, unfortunately, with us through 2024, I fear. You know, and obviously for those of you who might not be as conversant on this case, it's a case where it was brought on behalf of this corporation, Hobby Lobby, that is a closely held corporation started by a family where they allege that the requirement for them to provide insurance coverage on contraception violates their own religious freedom rights. And so the Supreme Court had to grapple with another question about what are the rights of a corporation? Are they like the rights of the individual in terms of freedom of speech?
Shades of Citizens United.
Shades of Citizens United, a different facet of that same dilemma, the same issue. And the court held lamentably 5-4, as you all know, that the closely held corporations do have a right to exercise their religious liberty and deny insurance coverage for broader contraception. Now, let's be very clear. That includes not just abortion, which should be guaranteed, in my mind, but also IUDs, all sorts of different reproductive technologies that are normally covered by an employer. And the Supreme Court, in a very unfortunate decision, read the dissent from Justice Ginsburg. Skip the opinion. You know enough about the opinion. Where she talks about it being a harbinger of a very treacherous path down a slippery slope, where we have now credentialed the religious freedom rights of the corporation over the personal individual rights of the employees. Now, Hobby Lobby employs 13,000 people. This is not your local deli, right? And there are a lot of closely held corporations, the Marriott, for instance. Luckily, we're at the Hotel Jerome. It's a great institution with some of the fine leadership. I know some of them personally. And I know that the Hotel Jerome would never assert its religious liberty rights over the rights of its employees. But we could very well be confronted. Marriott, I think, owned by Mormons. You could find an effort now to carve out the rights of individuals, of employees, because we're going to give greater credence to their employers. Now, looking 10 years ahead.
Yeah, let's talk about using religion to discriminate.
That's the big one, right? So we're winning You know, I'm the eternal optimist. You have to be. I can't do this job for the last 13 years and not be optimistic. We have more rights today, I think, by and large, than we had 13 years ago, and we can talk about them in a bunch of different contexts. We've had setbacks, but we're making progress. And our opponents, both I think on the reproductive freedom side and on the gay rights side, have finally understood that their agenda of being anti-woman and anti-gay doesn't work anymore, right? They have to package it a little bit differently because it's just the war on women or the war on gays is not a very good message island for them to pivot off of, right? So they've had to come up with this idea to say that we believe in these rights, but you can't force us, those who might not have the same beliefs, to comply with federal laws if it conflicts with our own religious freedom rights. So they have now posited this clash of rights, of religious freedom on the one hand and equality under the law in the other, and saying, it's fine if you want to get married, but don't force me to host or to allow you to use our hotel for your same-sex marriage. Or don't force me, if I'm a school counselor, to provide counseling to LGBT youth or to young women who want to understand contraception. And so the worry that we have is that they have now been very crafty in being able to use a civil liberties framework, saying religious freedom and the protection of individual rights and religious belief is the response to progress we've made elsewhere. And so what I fear over the next 10 years is you're going to find efforts to really carve out the kind of spheres where these equal protection laws don't apply in every context under the basis of religious grounds.
You describe this idea, but it's really not a new idea, is
No.
it? I mean, in the 1960s, I think I'm right, you had people saying, I'm not going to serve black people at my restaurant because God does not believe black people and white people should be together.
And we fought and won those. And now they're coming back in a very different context where they're saying exactly the same thing in the context of gay equality or on religious freedom. And it's going to be an important battle for us to continue to wage. We always make the point that once you are engaged in the broader body politic, that your individual rights don't have the trump value that they do in your own personal life. Like I use this example of my grandmother, who is no longer alive, so I should probably not use her name in vain. She was a wonderful woman. I loved the woman, and she loved me. But I always use the example that my grandmother decided to take her extra set of bedrooms in her old house and turn it into a bed and breakfast, that she would be precluded from saying, oh no, I don't want a lesbian or gay couple staying at my bed and breakfast. Because once she enters into the public domain and is offering a public accommodation where the local laws in terms of egress and smoke detectors and sales tax for hotel rooms, that grandma gives up her right to be a homophobe when she wants to make money in the body politic by turning her home into a bed and breakfast. Now, grandma could, she never did this to me, so this is why it's unfair, but grandma could say, oh, I don't want Anthony coming up here with his boyfriend because, you know, I just don't want to have them under my house because I'm a Catholic. Now, she never did that to me, but she would have that right to deny her grandson the ability to stay in her bedroom with his boyfriend. But quite different when she begins to enter the public domain. And so those are the arguments we're going to have to go through.
You say it's a clash of rights, but is it really? I mean, isn't this, I mean, talk about the argument on the other side about religious freedom.
You know, there are some limited places where you want to be careful not to force kind of our broader body politic understanding of these rights on religious institutions. The place where we kind of are very careful is that, you know, we don't think, I mean, I'm a fallen Catholic, very much fallen, but we don't think you can apply, for instance, the kind of the equal protection of the laws to require the Catholic Church to have a women priest. I think it'd be a very good idea. But you can't use our civil rights laws to force the church to allow women priests or even openly gay priests. And so you want to make sure that you preserve the right for religious institutions to make those decisions and to kind of say, this is our worldview. And those are rights that are very important to protect. Now, the minute you have the Catholic Church playing a broader role in secular service delivery, for instance, in Catholic hospitals or Catholic schools, those rules should be really revisited. For instance, Catholic hospitals, we have a case, and we'll look forward. I'm trying to make sure we don't look only at the present. We have a case out of Detroit. Tamisha Means is our client. She's a woman who wanted to have a child, was 8 months pregnant, and began to have trouble in labor, and went to her local hospital, Catholic hospital, which is also happens to be more than 75% funded, but with state and government money. Because even though it's a Catholic hospital, it's mostly your and my money that supports these Catholic hospitals. And the first day she went in with the pain, they said, go home and be well. And she came back the next day, and they told her to go home and pray. And the third day, she came back into the hospital with great pain, and they told her, go home, and then she started giving birth to the fetus, a breech birth. The fetus did not survive. The Catholic hospital never informed her that it was a troubled pregnancy that threatened not just the life of the fetus, but also the life of herself. Never informed her of the ability to have a late-term termination to make sure that at least her life would be safeguarded. And so we brought a lawsuit against the Catholic bishops. It's created a lot of consternation with my mother, who is still very Catholic, saying that the promulgation of their policy that Catholic hospitals cannot even inform a woman of her medical rights in a Catholic hospital that's largely funded with taxpayer money is bad public policy. And so that for us is a place where we have to be very mindful that as we move forward, and as you look 10 years from now, and I would say even in 2 years, we'll have full LGBT equality in the law, right? We'll have full LGBT equality in the law. Oh, we're still litigating that case. We're still litigating that case. She's alive. Tamisha is alive. She's our plaintiff.
I like this spirit with questions from the audience.
So it's great.
This is great. This is
But
great.
we're going to win LGBT. I would say the Supreme Court will take the next same-sex marriage case, maybe next term, in 2015, maybe 2016. We'll win marriage, and then we'll have to clean up all the rest of the detritus in the rest of the country about formal equality law. But we're going to clip. We're done. We won. We won. And so you're going to find these religious refusals, which is what we have to find a better way to describe it, these religious refusal arguments popping up in very different contexts as a way to carve out the big wins that we're on the cusp of. And those are going to be state by state, context by context, and so we'll have our work cut out for us.
All right, let's just jump around some of the different areas in which the ACLU is involved and look forward. I think you joined the ACLU just a matter of days before 9/11.
1 week before 9/11,
And this decade, no one could have foreseen, I think, how civil liberties would have been changed in the name of the war on terror.
No.
Look 10 years from now. It looks like the war on terror, although people don't call it that, or at least some don't, is not going to go away.
No.
What's the landscape going to look like 10 years from now? What do you fear it could look like? What do you think it will look like? And what do you think it should look like?
I'll end with the should, because you always want to end on a better note. Because here's where I'm not so optimistic. And I work at it every day. I think many of the policies that were put in place in the aftermath of 9/11 with the legacy of George Bush have lamentably become part of a new normal. And our current president, President Obama, if he wasn't the architect of these policies, he was certainly the contractor who built the house of these policies. The policies were put in place by George Bush, and he kept many, if not most of them. And so we've created now this new normal where it would be much harder to retire some of these policies. I was much more optimistic in the beginning of the Obama presidency, because I thought, okay, now's the flashpoint. We get to switch gears, we get to gut the stuff that they put in place, and we'll get back to basic principles. But lamentably, that's not been the approach of this president in the last 6 years on national security and civil liberties. So for instance, on surveillance, the whole NSA revelations of Edward Snowden. And the whole questions about whether or not the government has the ability or should have the right to seize the records of your phone calls and your emails and warehouse it and then query a database if they think you might be suspicious. Begun under President Bush, continued under President Obama.
And the trend?
I think it's going to be very hard to undo that, absent some court litigation. I think forget Congress on this issue. It's not, with all due respect to good members of Congress who are in the audience and at Aspen, the only thing to do in Congress is to cluck and to talk to the press, because there's not much work getting done in Congress, in case you haven't guessed. So I don't really have much belief that Congress will fix the NSA or surveillance issues.
I have one very specific question looking at 2024.
What, the role of Congress?
Well, no, not that. Edward Snowden, you're
He'll
his
be back
lawyer.
in America.
Where is he going to be? You describe him as a great American and a true patriot. Is he going to be a free man in the United States
Yes.
in 2024?
I think so. Look, it's just incredible. He'll be back in America. Either this president will find a way to pardon him, or the next president will find a way to bring him back. It's untenable, the idea that we leave Edward Snowden in Putin's Russia, where Putin gets to use him as a puppet for his own propaganda. It's not very good public relations from a foreign policy perspective. The public interest, even though divided on Edward Snowden, this is not a man that is a clear slam dunk for the government to treat him as the traitor that they describe him to be. I think, especially with young people who are much more positive and supportive of Edward Snowden. And if you actually happen to have a Rand Paul president, I think it might be one of his first acts as president to find a way to grant clemency and amnesty and bring him back into America to build public trust. So I think he will be a free man, and I think we'll look at his actions the way we now look at the actions of Daniel Ellsberg. If those of you in the audience remember Daniel Ellsberg, who helped us understand the Pentagon Papers. And I think there are very few people who now think of Daniel Ellsberg as a traitor or as an un-American actor in American politics. From both the Republican and Democratic Party, they saw his role in the Pentagon Papers as essential.
So what you describe, Anthony, is the new normal. That could include continued use of drones?
Yeah, the drones.
Targeted killings, even of U.S. citizens?
Yeah, the drone issue will be interesting when the Chinese and the Russians start using their own drones, right? Because then all of a sudden, our rules that we've only applied to ourselves will become a little bit too broad for our counterparts in Russia and China. And so there might be a revisiting of the drones, but that, we represent the father of Anwar al-Awlaki, who's an American citizen who was targeted for killing in Yemen. He was born in America, went to Yemen. He's a Muslim fundamentalist, he was. And the government bragged about the idea that they were going to take him out. His father, who's a permanent resident, came to us and said, wait a minute, how can the U.S. government target my son for assassination without any due process? We brought the case, we lost the case because the judge said Mr. Anwar al-Awlaki is an adult. His father doesn't have standing to bring the case on his son's behalf. So he bounces out of court, and then the government did, in fact, kill him, and not just kill Mr. al-Awlaki, but also his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. The little boy was worried about, where's daddy? Where did he go? Why is he in Yemen? And why did he leave us? And so the kid went to find where dad went, and he was in Yemen at the wrong time in the wrong place, and the 16-year-old American citizen was also killed by a drone. And so now we are still in the process of litigating wrongful death actions, Freedom of Information Act litigation, to talk about the criteria that we've used to target American citizens for execution outside of the theater of war. It's kind of a breathtaking assertion of executive power, all done by President Obama. And so I think the drone issue is going to continue to be a big one, especially drones are unmanned aircraft, war aircraft. And as you find their proliferation in other zones, we'll have a debate here about whether or not the rules that we've asserted for ourselves should be the rules of the Chinese or the Russians or other countries begin to use.
Some of the other new normals, 10 years from now, what about discrimination in the form of, say, racial profiling?
You know, I think one of the things that's most lamentable about the 9/11 context is that we were winning on racial profiling. It was one of those things that we were able to describe it as un-American before 9/11. The driving while black and brown, remember that controversy about how cops pulled over people because they were black or brown on the highway, and then were targeting them specifically. And then with 9/11, racial profiling became necessary as a way to figure out who might be the enemy within. You know, I think that ultimately some of the things that we'll have to come back to basic principles will be to kind of to show that the use of racial profiling in the national security context really has to be revisited. And I think it has a lot to do, and this is maybe a kind of a punt to the Aspen Ideas Festival, is Americans don't understand Muslims. The level of Islamophobia is so deep in America. And you know, I am not an expert at it. I just happen to have been assigned to Muslim roommates at Princeton. And so I learned quickly, you know, a Sikh and a Muslim and me, a Puerto Rican boy from the Bronx who's Catholic. And so I learned quickly about some of these world religions.
And you learned that Sikhs are
not Muslims. No. I didn't even know. I said, you know.
Have a turban.
I have a turban. And I think there's going to be a real need. One of the upcoming reports that will come out of the Snowden documents, I don't think I'm stealing anyone's thunder because there's already been some press reported about it, is that there will be a series of documents that will get analyzed by Glenn Greenwald, one of the journalists working with Snowden, about how the government has actually conducted surveillance on American citizens who are Muslim, who are in public life. And so individuals who are heads of mosques or public interest groups have been subject to the type of surveillance that Hoover did on Martin Luther King. Now, if this were a different America, that would be enough of the flashpoint to say, why is the government conducting surveillance on American citizens who've done nothing wrong, and why are we tracking their conversations and their actions and their activities? But I fear that the level of Islamophobia or Muslim, or the lack of knowledge about Muslim Americans will make that not have the impact it ought to have. And so I think part of what we'll have to do is to understand much better about the diversity within America. I think America's come a long way. As a Hispanic American, there's a much greater understanding about the contributions, the diversity, the roles of Hispanic Americans, much greater recognition of the role and the importance of the African American community and its heritage and legacy. And I still don't think we're quite there yet on
Let's move
Muslims.
around a little bit about some other areas of priority for the Civil Liberties Union. What about criminal justice 10 years from now?
I think we're going to win that one. I mean, this one's amazing. I see now the optimist comes back. Partly because we so screwed it up. I mean, we have the highest incarceration rate of any nation in the world, higher per capita than China. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population. 1 out of every 3 African American men between the ages of 18 and 33 are either in the criminal justice system or have been connected through it through parole or whatnot. It's a phenomenal failure. And
a costly one.
And that's the brilliant of it. I mean, this is where I love Aspen because I get to kind of make people's eyebrows raise. But I was at one of your fantastic receptions, and I spend most of my time talking with Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist. And
you don't do that all the time?
I love them. I have to say, I love them on some issues.
That's what we.
And Newt Gingrich is working with us on the criminal justice issues. You know, he's part of a coalition called Right on Crime, where conservatives have said, if we want to have a limited government and we want to shrink budget deficits, the way is to deal with the over-incarceration issue. And that's a brilliant way for us to move the ball forward. And Grover Norquist the same way. He's a man who's concerned about tax policy. One way to kind of cut taxes is to cut government expenditures on crime. And so we've been working with conservatives. I actually think this is one of the places where we're making progress. And even some of the moderate Democrats who have often been the last to understand this phenomenon are now getting the religion on this issue, if you will. You have the president and the attorney general announcing this thing called the Clemency Project, where they will allow nonviolent drug offenders who are serving life sentences without parole, right? So just think about that. Nonviolent drug offenses where people are given life sentences without parole, 25,000 people in federal crimes who can now apply for clemency to be let out. And this is a place where at the state level, it's in Louisiana, you have Governor Jindal who's here. We were able to work with his office in passing a bill on geriatric prisoners. You know, the war on drugs started with Nixon in the 1970s. So some of the men, mostly men who were incarcerated early on, were in the 1970s, and maybe they were 30. 50 years later or 40 years later, they're in their 70s or 80s. And we went into these prisons and we filmed them. We took photographs. You have the guys on dialysis, on ventilators, on intubators. And you kind of say, are these folks still a threat to our society? And having them in nursing homes behind bars costs double the amount of money than putting them in nursing homes without bars. And so there's been an effort then to release geriatric prisoners because of the cost issue.
And what about the marijuana law here in Washington? What's that going to do? How do you see those developing, and what's the implication?
You know, when you look at the kind of the trajectory of marijuana law reform, and the ACLU believes that marijuana should be regulated by the government and not made a crime. You know, questions around addiction and substance abuse, just like alcohol, are ones that are best left to the individual, the government to regulate it and to deal with it as a public health issue. And I think depending on how things turn out here in Colorado and elsewhere, that there could be a rethinking about the use of marijuana, small amounts of marijuana as crimes. It's one of the feeders into the criminal justice system. We did a report recently about marijuana arrests that shows that indeed people do get arrested and do jail time on marijuana arrests. And it's often the entry point to other troubles with the criminal justice system. If we could just re-divert that kind of feeding tube into the criminal justice system, we could bring the numbers way down. So I actually am hopeful. I think in the next 10 years, we'll have 50%. I mean, I'm now going out on a limb, and hopefully we will succeed. But I think we'll have 50% of the prison population be now 2.5 million people. I say 1.2,
wow.
1 million in 10 years. And lamentably, it's been mostly the concern about money that has moved the agenda. That's not the reason why we're involved in it. We're in it from a moral authority perspective. But we'll use every argument we can, and we'll work with anyone who's on our side who can help us move the needle forward.
Abortion and reproductive freedom,
Yeah,
10 years from now. I mean, we talked about how, this religious backdoor is, but I mean, it seems that there continue to be efforts to restrict in ways around the constitutional limitations.
My big hope here as an optimist is that the reproductive technologies will evolve so much so that the use of abortion as a form of birth control will become so limited that then we'll fight about a much smaller number of cases or individuals or women.
But doesn't the Hobby Not Lobby case give you a little discouraging news there? Because even, I mean...
the morning after pill doesn't have to be covered.
Yeah, but the morning after pill, it's not like there's no fertilization, yet the legal arguments are that it is like abortion, and
it could end up that way. I mean, that's where it's moving. That's where the law is moving. This is one where it's moving in the wrong direction. And I have to say, I don't know the silver bullet other than to give it everything we've got. And in Texas, for instance, where they now have passed laws that require doctors to have admission privileges in clinics so that they can perform abortions, it's just another way to shrink the supply of doctors who will do these procedures. And it's all clouded around patient safety, that doctors should be members of the community and enrolled in the hospitals where they conduct these services. That's not the reason that they're doing it. They're doing it exactly as a way to infringe upon a woman's right to abortion. I personally, I mean, it's very controversial. I find the mumbling of the word abortion troubling, right? And maybe it's just because I'm a gay guy who came of age in the AIDS epidemic, in New York City, that part of what we were able to do is get very vocal and get very aggressive about lifting the stigma of being gay. And when you have a right that is enshrouded in shame and in silence and in shadows, that right will wither. And when you look at the numbers, about 1 out of 3 women have had access to or have utilized the termination of a pregnancy through an abortion. And the stigma that's attached to women who use that, and it's never an easy decision. And no woman that I know of has ever gone through an abortion has gone at it in a very cavalier fashion. And yet we have stigmatized a whole group of our society, 1/3 of women, who sit there and hear these arguments about that we can't trust them to make their own decisions, that these are easy decisions for them and that we know better than they do. And that, frankly, I hope, and it's very hard for me to say this as a man because I don't live that stigma. I lived a different stigma. But I think that until and unless we lift the scarlet letter A on abortion and we don't mumble it, and we say it is your right to believe what you want in religious terms about the terminating of a pregnancy, but it is quite different for you to insert that right on the rest of everyone else. And how dare you question the moral fabric of a woman who terminates a pregnancy with the input and guidance of her family, of her doctor, of her own conscience. Who are you to question that moral authority of that individual woman? Until we come back and until we come back and assert that and lift the stigma and do away with the scarlet letter A, the fight on abortion, I think, will be one that will continue.
Looking 10 years ahead, I mean, who could have predicted the pace of development of digital technology?
Yeah, it's amazing.
And law cannot keep up with it. 10 years from now, I mean, we're already facing all these issues with GPS, and it's not just the government, it's commercial enterprises.
Commercial enterprises.
So look in your crystal ball and tell us about what you see there and what the ACLU is worried about.
I think there are a couple of things. I think first we have to talk about the right to privacy not as citizens' rights, but as basic human rights across the globe. The idea that American citizens have more privacy rights when the government wants to conduct surveillance on them, but that non-citizens don't have the same protections. Or even when that American citizen goes overseas, that the government has the ability to access your data. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, there's this recent report also from the Snowden documents that the content of every single phone call out of the Bahamas has been recorded and turned over from the NSA to the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, right, for drug interdiction. The content of every single phone call.
This is not metadata.
No, it's not metadata. This is the content. So I was saying before, like, it's crazy. If I take my 19-year-old nephew to the Bahamas on a family vacation, and he uses his cell phone because he wants to smoke a joint on the beach and watch the sunset, and his government is able to access that information and then possibly use it against him in a drug prosecution when he comes back to America, why does that make a difference? Because he's sitting in the Bahamas versus sitting in Florida. And so we need to start thinking differently about the privacy rights, not just about the location, because information doesn't know geography. And we need to think differently about the rights of individuals, so they're not just citizenship rights. And so to be thinking about the kind of a Magna Carta, if you will, for privacy rights, I think would be very interesting. And I think that new technologies that will evolve, oh my God, we're not prepared for all this. And we at the ACLU, we're working really hard to catch up, but we're still far behind. We brought a recent case in the Supreme Court where we won on challenging the right of a corporation, Myriad, to own 2 human genes that are essential to the formation of breast cancer, the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene. So if you have these 2 genes in your body, you have a higher propensity for breast cancer.
My mother had them.
My mom too. And that's why we took the case. Well, not only, I mean, but that's, there was a lot of controversy at the ACLU. It's like, if we take this case, will we undo patent law? Will we undo the intellectual property system? And there were a lot of battles within the organization. It was mostly the boys against the girls. The girls were very concerned about breast cancer. The boys were concerned about intellectual property. They came to me. I said, we're taking the case. My mom has the
Don't those boys all have mothers?
Not always. They don't remember them at the office. And so we challenged the idea that Myriad would be able to own the intellectual property of the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene, and which they exerted. So if you wanted to get a second opinion, if you had the BRCA1, BRCA2 combination, you couldn't get one because it was only their genes where you could do the test. The test wasn't covered by insurance because since they collected royalties on the tests, the cost of these tests were incredibly high. So women on Medicare and Medicaid couldn't get the genetic test for predisposition of breast cancer. The mutations of some of these genes, so you have 10 genes that have mutated off of the BRCA1, BRCA2, but there could be an 11th, a 12th, and they impeded other oncologists and researchers from using the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene to do research. They actually sent cease and desist orders to breast cancer researchers at some of the major hospitals. So we brought this case. I said, you can't own a BRCA1, BRCA2 gene. The genes are in nature. It's like saying, I own gravity, I own a leaf of an oak tree. You don't get to own that. That's all of ours. And we won, and we're able to knock down that patent.
I want to open it up in a minute, but I want to at least cover one other area that seems to me fundamental to all of our rights, and that's voting.
Yeah.
And a basic democratic right. And this is something the ACLU has been dealing with for more than 9 decades. Mm-hmm. But talk to us a little bit about what you see down the road, what you see the impediments, whether it's voter suppression efforts of one kind or another, voter ID, voter hours, other things. I mean, why can't, if you turn 18, you just automatically get registered to vote? I mean, what's happening and where is it going to go?
It's a very partisan issue. So I guess my bottom line is when the issues break across party lines and the Democrats have one position, the Republicans have another, it's really hard to find the way forward, right? So abortion is one of those issues. Voting is another one of those issues. When you have a coincidence of some parts of the Democratic Party and some parts of the Republican Party, you can make huge progress, like criminal justice reform, like LGBT equality, right? That's one of the reasons why we're winning, is because we have parts of the Republican Party that are, if they're not for gay rights, they're neutral, which is, neutrality is fine, as long as they're not a no. And I think, unfortunately, voting is one of those places where many of the Republican leaders in the states have enacted more stringent voter requirements to access the right to the franchise. When you look at every single one of the voter ID cases that have been enacted, they've always been through Republican governors and Republican legislatures. And it looks so simple when you say, what's the problem? Show us your photo ID and you get to vote. And it makes a lot of sense until you find people who don't have photo IDs and can't get them. Like one of our clients out of Wisconsin is a 92-year-old African-American woman born in the rural South who, when she was born, the way they registered her birth, she knows her birthday because they wrote it on the back of the family Bible. And that's how they register her birth. And she voted in every election up until this last one. And they said, until you give us a photo ID, you can't come to the poll again. And she says, well, I can't get a photo ID because I don't have a birth certificate. I was never registered. And they carved her out of the electoral process on purpose as a way that the Republican leadership has understood, and the ACLU is non-partisan. We've never endorsed a candidate for office, never opposed or support a candidate for elected office or appointed office based on politics. But the Republicans understand that many of the low-income and often minority communities that don't have photo IDs often vote Democrat. And so they impose these requirements as a way to limit the universe of voters who might vote for their opponents.
What about voter fraud?
I mean, really, the idea that there is rampant voter fraud, I find so remarkable, right? So much of this is fueled by a concern about undocumented individuals voting in elections. And until we have a photo ID, until we're able to show their citizenship, that they'll vote in the election. Now, that is just so illogical. If you are in this country in an undocumented status, right, and you are always driving the speed limit, and you are working so hard to avoid any interaction with the government whatsoever, because that interaction could lead to your deportation back to Mexico or El Salvador, do you really think you're going to have legions of undocumented Americans who are going to walk into a voter booth and say, I want to vote today? I mean, it's not logical. There's no proof that voter fraud is a problem. When there's been voter fraud, it's been often perpetrated by parties or by groups. And so you could regulate voter fraud in having much greater strictures on institutions and parties that register people to vote, and not make the individual the target of your effort to deal with voter fraud. But until you show that there are millions of undocumented Mexicans who are running into the voting booth as a way to throw and subvert our national elections, this is just pure poppycock. And it is carving out the rights of American citizens to vote. And the vote is something that's so essential. If you ask me, one of the rights, I was just doing a kind of an interview with the Khan Academy folks who are great, and I'm trying to talk to younger people. I think they're all important. All these rights are important. The right to vote for me is one of the most essential, because it's the one that makes this government accountable. Because the government will get it wrong. They will continue to get it wrong. That's why we've been around for 94 years, and we'll be around for 94 more, because they're always going to get it wrong in some instances. The only way to get it right is to have the government accountable to the public, to the body politic. And when you begin to restrict the right to vote and to hold your government accountable, you're cutting off that kind of really important kind of accountability feedback loop that's going to hold it accountable on social welfare, on education, on roads, on things like abortion, on things like gay rights. That cutting off of the voter accountability mechanism, I think, is the most pernicious attack on civil liberties and civil rights. And I think, ultimately, the parties will understand that this is not working to their benefit. Rand Paul, right? I'm not doing a commercial for Rand Paul. But I will say, what was his comment on voter ID? Very practical. He said, why are we alienating the very communities that are going to be essential to the success of the Republican Party going forward? Hallelujah. Someone just talks. He doesn't even have to say the merits of it. He's just from a very practical perspective. And with the changing demographics, I'm hoping that some other leaders in the Republican Party will understand that this effort to carve out a community that you will alienate, and they won't vote for you. And they will vote for your opponents. They might actually come back and see that their self-interest is in making these procedures much more open. I think the best way to move the public interest is to play to stakeholders' self-interest. It's a little cynical to end on this note, but I think that if you can show the fact that this makes all of us better, and that it makes our country stronger, and that it makes all the parties stronger, I think that's the way to move the ball forward.
But we're not ending, because we're opening it up for questions from all of you. And because this is all being recorded, I asked you to wait for the microphone first over there. And if you could give us your name and a very quick question ending with a question mark.
Hi, my name's Connor Friedersdorf. I was wondering if you could tell us any more about the Muslim Americans who were spied on, if this will possibly open up an equal protection lawsuit.
Yeah.
And if this was approved by the FISA court or just done by the NSA.
I don't know the specifics. The reason why I can talk to you openly about it, there was a Washington Times article that was a prelude to the news story. And certainly I think it will be very interesting to see who's on this list. And I don't know. I mean, I have met Edward Snowden twice in Russia. I'm part of his legal team, but we stay far afield from some of these questions because that's not a proper role for an attorney-client conversation. The journalists are the ones doing this work, and so we'll know much more. I think it will be very interesting to see if there are individuals who are members of Congress who've been targeted or surveilled. I think it will be interesting to see what type of judicial review has been invoked to look at their surveillance. I mean, part of the challenge is it's not like the good old days when Hoover used to type up not Hoover, but his secretary, or Clyde, his friend, would type up the Romero, Anthony on a manila folder and stick in a whole bunch of dossiers into a manila folder and then file it in a metal cabinet. This is a database. So all the data is there. The question is, what have they pulled from the database? So you actually have to recreate the queries on the database to see that which they've pulled. And so it's a little bit, it's very labor intensive. It doesn't just spit out something that says, Romero, they followed him, to the local store. You have to read the code. It involves a lot of technologists. And part of the reason why the journalists have taken as long as they have in doing these stories is that they're very complicated to pull them out of kind of massive amounts of data. So we'll stay tuned.
Okay, the woman with her hand up, and then we're going to move over to this side. So we'll have to get a microphone over here ready, please.
Yes, Louise Coucha. I have a question regarding immigration. When do you think we'll have an effective immigration policy?
Yeah.
And two, when will the ACLU help to portray a more balanced, picture of the immigrants? Because as it stands, 11 million are considered all Mexican, when in fact 55%, according to the Pew Research Center, are Latino, and the other 45% are non-Hispanics.
Yes.
And are never discussed, nor are they written about. So I would like to see what the ACLU will do.
Great, thank you. And thank you for that very gentle correction, because I did speak in shorthand. But obviously the undocumented community is much broader than just the Mexican-American community. We're large communities of Asian Americans of all walks of life, and a lot of African immigrants who often get left off in the discussion as well. So I take your point, and I appreciate that clarification. Immigration, it's one of those issues, again, it's where the kind of, unless it kind of breaks the logjam between Democrats on the one hand, Republicans on the other, you're not going to find much headway. It's only with the coincidence of that. And so hopefully within the Republican Party there will be an effort to kind of take up immigration reform. I think it's been dead for a lot longer than people have announced it to be. I actually fault some of the policies of this president that have brought us to a point where it's a failed policy initiative. I think it's been a very Faustian bargain that the Obama administration's had to say we're going to get tough on immigration, on enforcement and border control, and as a way to lay up the possibility for comprehensive immigration reform. And so they haven't gotten comprehensive immigration reform, and we've had a complete militarization of our border that has been a debacle in terms of the numbers of people who are detained and deported, the infringement on personal liberties, in which the Department of Homeland Security is an agency that has been on steroids for years and is largely out of control along the border. Literally, the stories are just coming out now of people who are subjected to abuse by Customs and Border Enforcement officers. We've been documenting for years. We have offices in every state, and our southern border offices in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California have been really overwhelmed with the immigration issue. We have been largely focused on the detention and deportation and the mistreatment of immigrants in government custody. We've been working on immigration reform, but that's been a place where we've been more of a B priority. We've been primarily focused on, let's look at these kind of facilities where people are being warehoused. And it's so corrupt. You have two corporations, right? Two privately held corporations. Check your stock portfolios. If you have money in Correction Association of America or on geocities.com, sell the stock, right? So these are publicly traded corporations that build facilities, prisons, but their big growth has been immigration detention centers. And when they lobby their local state governments to get these contracts for private prisons, they put in the contracts a requirement that the beds will be full by certain percentage points, like 75, 80%. They won't build the private prisons unless you guarantee the prisoners to pay for the prisons. And so you've created this perverse incentive where the taxpayers have privatized the criminal justice system, where the corporations require government to give them the patience to the detainees in the system, and shareholders are making a mint off of it, including the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates, including some of our donors, who I won't be as quick to name. Mr. Gates doesn't give us money, and so I can name him. You have, it's a little tweak, I've been trying. You have individuals, you have Thurgood Marshall Jr., who's on the board of directors of the Correctional Association of America. I find it really hard to understand how they have kind of reconciled that legacy with that mission of that corporation. So it's really one of those places, especially along the border, that is a place of enormous concern. And we are ramping up our advocacy against private prisons. We may be buying stock in some of these corporations as a way to bring shareholder litigation, because the way to attack the corporations is often from within. Pull the portfolio on geocities.com. Pull the investor portfolio, which I'm looking at because I might buy a share, so I can sue them. But they talk about their prisons as if they were Club Med. You would think you're in Aspen, the way they describe their prisons. And it is just a phenomenal breach of information to shareholders, because I think they're misleading shareholders in thinking that they're running fine prisons. So we might sue them on that. And we might also look at other ways of tackling it in terms of the lobbying and the corruption with the state legislatures. There's a lot for all of us to do on this issue.
Let me just mention on the issue of immigration, for those of you who didn't get a chance to watch a film that we debuted last evening called Underwater Dream, look for it in the theaters in July. It's one of the most powerful evocations of the problems faced by undocumented Americans. It's extraordinarily moving and has the power, I think, to change the conversation across the country. Over here, woman over on the side.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Lori Berman.
Hi, Lori.
Hi. I'd appreciate it if you talk a little bit about the future of separation of church and state. I feel like we're moving a little bit in the wrong way.
Yeah.
The New York court case about prayer in public meetings, some Sharia law. So I'd appreciate your input on that. Thank you.
I mean, this is like one of the kind of the basic issues of the ACLU. It's one of the first issues that we grappled with. Many of you don't know all the cases that we're involved in. So, for instance, the right to teach evolution in public science classrooms, the Monkey Trial, Inherit the Wind, Clarence Darrow, our case, the right to remain silent, Miranda, our case, the right to a court-appointed attorney, Gideon, our case, the right to contraception, Griswold, our case, the right for interracial couples to marry, Loving, our case, the striking down of the Defense of Marriage Act with Edie Windsor, our case. And so some of these are, what's new is what's old. And so you find efforts to dress up the kind of the insertion of sectarian belief in public institutions continues. We had the intelligent design case out of Dover, Pennsylvania, where they were saying that they were trying to teach in public science classrooms that we were not evolved from apes, but that we were the result of an intelligent designer. I always thought it was like Dolce Gabbana, but it was. And we had to kind of strip it out and show that this is teaching religion in public science classrooms and inappropriate. I think, I break it down a couple ways. I think the more symbolic infringement on religious freedom, where you have public prayers in public meetings, or even some of the placement of religious symbols in public spaces. We've won much of what we're going to win. I think the only thing is going to be, there will be setbacks there. But I think we've largely been able to clean up the symbolic religious expression in public places. I think the place where we have to be much more conscious has been on this religious refusals piece, the idea of the clashing of religion against some of the protections we're securing in other contexts. And I think the insertion of religion in public institutions, especially in schools. I'm much more troubled. I'm troubled by all of it, as you can imagine, but I have to choose what I get really worked up over. I'm much more troubled about teaching the Bible in a public classroom in Texas, in Odessa, where we've been litigating this issue, than I am a nativity scene in front of the East Hampton town hall. Just drive by on the East Hampton, the nativity scene. But when you teach religion to students who are malleable, who are young, who are diverse, and you teach religious dogma as science in a public science classroom, that's where I worry. And that's where we'll have to be attentive to, I think.
Can we bring a microphone to the front row here? And then we're only going to have time perhaps for one other question, as we do have to let everyone get back to the next sessions.
Deepika Rai, I want to ask you, in 2024, do you see the codification of a hierarchy of rights to make things like Habi Dhabi more clear and less likely to occur, and right to own guns and those kinds of questions becoming clearer?
I think the whole question of a codification of rights, I've been resistant from an effort to try to think about constitutional amendments that would try to codify where the law has gone wrong. So, for instance, campaign finance on Citizens United about whether or not corporations are people and then can fund candidates. It's a disastrous opinion. It kind of is corrupting our political system. I think the only response to money in politics is public financing. There's been some effort to say, well, we should have another constitutional amendment to say that corporations don't have these rights to contribute to candidates. I am resistant of the idea of a constitutional amendment process because we'll end up with fewer rights at the end of the process than I think we're going in. And I think with this Congress and with the rancor among the political parties, we're going to kind of whittle away rights as opposed to expand rights. So I think the codification comes by using the existing laws that we have and then trying to apply them in different contexts. And it happens. I mean, look at the LGBT equality. Oh my God. Until 2004, it was still a crime to have consensual sex with a same-sex partner in many states, including Texas. And then from 2004 to today, we're on the cusp of full equality for LGBT people. It's going to take us a lot to get it applied in every state. But we're going to get there. And I'd rather focus on taking the wins that we've got and applying them as vigorously as we possibly can in all these different circumstances.
We have one question. One woman's been very persistent. She's moved to get my attention.
Okay.
But please make it quick. And
Asha from Palo Alto, California. I just wanted to say, as a first-generation American, that when I look at the rest of the world around us, if this was in India, that a Hindu majority was slowly transitioning into a Hindu minority, there would be nothing but bloodshed and disaster. And as an outsider who is now an American with my children growing up here, I can tell you that I'm just actually really proud as to how we are transitioning from from a white majority to possibly a white minority. And the way the country is transitioning is with peace and grace. That would not happen in any other country. So we need to celebrate that. We need to report on that. And I'm thankful that you mentioned about Rand Paul's comment about about the voter registration. Even if it was a practical comment, I just still think that I'm glad you brought it up, because we as a nation are really actually doing pretty okay compared to a lot of other countries out there.
It's true. And I'll just say this quickly. I know we have to end. It's just like, it's amazing. 1920, when the ACLU was born, women didn't have the right to vote. Blacks were second-class citizens by rule of law. There was no Supreme Court case attached to the freedom of speech or freedom of association. We have made so much progress in 94 years. I like you. My first to finish my family had finished high school. In most other countries in the world, the son of a man with a fourth grade education would have a fourth grade education. America is a great country, a great experiment, but it doesn't happen on its own. And these rights don't just pop up and spring up all by themselves. You need individuals, if you forgive the metaphor, you need the gardeners to grow these rights, to cultivate the soil, to make sure that the weeds don't crowd in, to make sure that people understand the importance of these rights. And that's where it involves each of you. It involves organizations like mine and many others to make sure that these rights just don't happen on their own. But I'm with you. I'm an optimist. You have to be. And it's a great privilege to do the work we do. And thank you for having me.
And it was a privilege to have you here.